Hi, I'm Miss Kara. I work at Bluegrass Green Source, and we're grateful to Live Green Lexington for allowing us to bring these awesome, fun activities to you today. We hope you enjoy.
Did you realize that the soil outside is made up of different particle sizes? If you were to dig your hands down into the soil, you might find a few different sized things whenever you pull it out. You see, that's because our soil is made up of four main particle sizes. We have gravel or pebbles, sand, silt, and clay. These four things make our soil either very kind of loomy, is a word that you might hear, which means it's got lots of air in it and it's kind of fluffy. Or it might make it very compact and hard. If you've ever tried to dig into the ground and it's not really easy to get into, it's probably because your soil has lots more clay. You see, the different size of those particles really affects what kind of soil quality we have. And it affects different things like how our plants grow and how erosion might affect different animals that live in the water. Another way of looking at it, as you can see here, I've got some different sizes on the board, kind of looking at the big one being gravel, the smaller one being sand, and the smallest little dot that's right in the middle would be silt. So I'm in a room that's about 12 foot by 12 foot. If that room were the size of a gravel particle, then sand would be about the size of me stretching out my arms. Wherever you are, think about that. Now, the next size particle would be do you remember? It would be the silt. So sand and then silt would be about this big. And the last particle size, the smallest one, would be clay. And clay would be really small and your arms would be really close together. If you imagine you were in a room full of people and everybody had their hands fall the way out, there would be a little bit more room between each other. And that would be what sand would be like if it were just sand, like on a beach. The silt, a little bit smaller, you would see people getting more compact, a little bit closer together. And then lots of people would be really close together whenever you have your clay and everybody has their hands close together. Now, let's look at what happens whenever different size soil particles get into the water. All right, let's pretend that today we're going to be the eggs of a hellbender, something that we can find here in Kentucky. Hellbenders are a species that is on the kind of critically watched list right now, and we can find them here throughout Kentucky. They're like a large salamander, and they live in fast-moving water, and they lay their eggs on the bottom of the water, much like many other amphibians. Now, imagine that I'm on an egg on the bottom of the water, at the bottom of a river or stream. I can't really move whenever things fall on top of me. You see, eggs of things like fish or different insects, like macroinvertebrates, or again, like amphibians, they rely on the moving water over top of them to bring oxygen to them to breathe. Mammals like you and I, we allow our mothers to breathe for us, but eggs don't have that kind of option. So they need that fast-moving water to bring that oxygen to them. Now, erosion can be a big problem for those eggs. And if I were an egg at the bottom of the water, I would want to make sure there wasn't a lot of things happening on top of me. Now, we're going to do a little experiment today, or a little demonstration rather, and we're going to be using things like some sand, gravel, and potting soil to represent our silt today. If you're doing this at home, you can do some different things like this. You can probably still find some gravel around here. You can use things like flour to represent your silt. You can use things like salt to represent your sand. So you can try to make some things like this at home. Now, at the bottom today, there's nothing in my water just yet. So my straw I have is touching the bottom of my cup because, like we mentioned, eggs can't move. So I'm going to breathe, so to speak, as an animal at the bottom of the water. And I'm going to do that by just blowing gently into the straw. My goal is just to blow and to see how long it takes me to create bubbles. So, demonstration would be, that was pretty easy. As soon as I started blowing, the bubbles started to form. Now, we're using a chart today to help us understand, okay, what is the connection between the particle size and the difficulty of breathing underwater? So, I thought that was pretty easy. So I'm going to mark breathing with just kind of that air as a 1. So I'm going to put a little check mark right here on the air square under the 1. Now, imagine that a storm is happening upstream and erosion is starting to happen along the banks of the water. As that deposition begins to fall on my head as a little egg, the first thing that's going to fall is the biggest particle size. Do you remember what the biggest particle size was? It was gravel. So we're going to put a little bit of gravel in our water now. If you make a little mess at home, that is a-okay. Just make sure to clean up afterwards. All right, we've got a little bit of gravel. Now it's very important to make sure that my straw stays at the bottom of the cup. So don't pull it up. Once it's down there, leave it there. Now, I'm going to try to blow again and see, is it still pretty easy for me to create bubbles? Because again, those bubbles represent my ability to breathe underwater. All right, here we go. Okay, that was still pretty easy, but I felt a little bit more resistance that time. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to mark that as a 2. If you are trying this at home and your results differ from mine, that's okay. It might still have been easy. But this isn't a challenge to see how hard we can blow. It's a challenge to see what it's like to be an egg at the bottom of the water. So don't try to blow harder just to create the bubbles. We're just trying to test to see how hard this would be if I were actually an egg. Now, the next particle size to fall on my head would be the sand. So we're going to have a little sand fall on top of me now. So I'm going to scoop a little bit of that sand. Again, make sure that your straw stays at the bottom of the cup. So I'm going to put that sand in the cup just like that. And you should start to notice some layers forming in your cup. So I've got the gravel at the bottom and a little bit of sand on top of that. Now, make a quick prediction. Do you think this is going to be harder, easier, or the same? I'm going to predict that it's going to be a little bit harder. So let's find out. That was definitely harder. I don't know if you could tell, but it took a little bit longer for me to get those bubbles up there. I'm definitely marking that as a 3. So you may notice that as the particle sizes are getting smaller, it's getting a little bit harder for me. Now, let's see what happens when I add the silt. Now, silt is a very fine particle size. And as it falls into the water, it's going to just kind of rest on top of the cup for a moment. And that's okay. I'm going to let that sit, and I'm going to let it slowly start to fall into the water. Now, whenever I do this in a classroom, a lot of students tell me this looks like something you might find at a coffee shop. But don't drink this. This is not going to be tasty. Now, think about this. We have gravel, which is kind of made up of rocks as they weather and break down. The same thing as sand. And silt and clay are similar situations. Today, we're not going to be using clay because clay in a particle form is like a powder, much like flour would be, but even smaller than that. And think about what you might use clay for. We use clay to make pots, and we may use clay to make vases, we use clay to make lots of different things, but it's usually very moldable, and that's because we've added water to the clay. If I put clay into here, it's all going to solidify and become one really compact thing. So we kind of already know what would happen if we put clay powder into the water today. But silt is just a little bit bigger, so we're going to try that out. All right, now if I look at this, I can already start to see the gravel and the sand, and I can see the silt as it's falling into the cup, and I can see a nice little black line right there as that silt has started to sit and settle on top of the sand. All right, let's see how this is. That's hard. Friends, I was blowing really hard. I don't know if you could tell, but that was hard. Watch, one more time. Yeah, I'm not gonna make any bubbles today. That's definitely a 5. I would make that a 10, but my chart today only goes up to 5. Now, here's the problem with that. While erosion is a very natural process, and there's a lot of things that we can't do to solve it, there are also a lot of things that we can do to help to slow it. You see, planting different plants along our riverbanks, like trees or wildflowers or cattails, their root systems help to hold all of that kind of sediment in place, helping to slow erosion over time. That's really helpful and important for some of our endangered species like the hellbender. Now, you might also think about what else would be laying their eggs in the water. Things like mosquitoes or things like mosquitoes. And we'll look at that in just a moment. So, as our particle sizes have gotten smaller, so too has the difficulty of breathing. So if I were a hellbender egg at the bottom of the water, I wasn't able to breathe at all by the time that deposition fell on my head. So I wouldn't survive. So think about other ways that erosion might be affecting species that live in the water. And let's talk about one more way that it impacts our world. All right, so let's talk about some of the other consequences of allowing the erosion to happen along our stream banks. We looked at our hellbenders, but let's switch gears and talk about something like a mosquito. We don't always care much for mosquitoes because they can be kind of a pest, especially in the summers. However, they do still play a very important and vital role in our ecosystems. Now, mosquitoes start off by laying their eggs in the water, and those eggs hatch into larvae. Those mosquito larvae provide excellent food for animals that live in the water, like tadpoles or even fish. Now, our food web today, we look at how those mosquitoes are going to be eaten by the fish or the frogs or even tadpoles. Now, imagine we're removing the mosquitoes. We've removed a very important food source for those two animals. Mosquitoes also provide food for bats, and they provide food for birds. Now, imagine that we get rid of the frogs. Those frogs are also providing food for things like they provide food to birds, different birds of prey, or to snakes. And those snakes are also food for birds of prey, those apex predators at the top of the food web. So by removing just mosquitoes because of erosion along the stream banks, we're having a lot of different negative impacts on that ecosystem and this important food web. So those animals that do rely on that food source are probably going to have to move away or find other locations to live, or they might unfortunately die out. Now, this can have impacts on our ecosystem, but also on things like tourism here in our state. We have whole systems and economies set up around fishing and bird watching. And if we remove things that live on the bottom of the water and that provide base food for some of these animals, and we start impacting this food web, we start impacting even things like our local economies. So whenever we start thinking about erosion, which is a natural process, it's important to remember things like we should plant trees along our stream banks or bushes and wildflowers as ways to hold that soil in place and to decrease the deposition in our water, because there are always unintended impacts of our choices, and we can always make good ones. Thanks for watching today.